Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of the LCLC podcast. The first season of this podcast is devoted to compiling an oral history of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, or the LCLC, a conference that began back in 1972 here at the University of Louisville and continued without interruption for 48 years until the cancellation of the 2021 conference due to the COVID pandemic. In this episode, I chat with Michael Anania, who headlined the LCLC After Dark Reading this past February 2022 during our 49th conference. Now a favorite among LCLC attendees, the After Dark Poetry Reading traditionally takes place at the historic Brown Hotel. Michael Anania is a poet, essayist, and fiction writer. His published work includes 12 collections of poetry, among them Selected Poems, In Natural Light, and his most recent, Songs and Clamors. His work is widely anthologized and has been translated into Italian, German, French, Spanish, and Czech. He's also published a novel, The Red Menace, and a collection of essays, In Plain Sight. While at the LCLC, Anania had the pleasure of attending a panel on his work featuring contributors to the recent festschrift, From the Word to the Place, edited by Lea Graham and published by Mad Hat Press. This episode of the LCLC podcast includes 2 snippets recorded from Anania's Brown Hotel reading. The first is the sonorous conclusion of On the Conditions of Place, the poem Michael selected to start his reading. The second features what for me was a real highlight of the night, the poem Tin Deo. Our discussion began with the question I like to ask all my guests here on the LCLC podcast. Just what is it you remember about your visit to Louisville?
Well, it was charming and exciting in a couple of ways. One was it's so much devoted to contemporary poetry and to that part of contemporary poetry that interests me the most. But, the 2 charming moments were the panel discussion about my work, which was, really amazing, interesting situation to be in, with 3 wonderful essays. And then the reading, which I can talk about in detail if you want to, but it was one of your questions. But the reading was amazing, not just because it was in such a convivial space with the open bar and the sort of lounge attitude, but also because it was filled with people who I know very well and who know my work very well. So it changes the dynamic of a reading when you're reading to an audience, as I did a couple of weeks ago in New York, of people who don't know your work. When you're reading to a group of people who know it extremely well and have known it for 25 or 30 years. So it's pretty amazing, and that was charming.
What's your process for getting your lineup together of what you're going to read?
Well, usually I have a sort of string of things that I think I might read, but I picked that when I wanted to read something older anyway, and that poem's from the very early 80s. But mostly because you were in the room when they had a slight disagreement after the panel discussion about whether or not that I'm a poet of place or a poet of time. And in its own complicated way, that poem takes up both of those questions.
I saw you once at the window, twisting a strand of hair around your finger, sunlight curling inward to your touch. Poplars in the wind, white underleaves like sea flowers, lines of foam, bright wings, and sails in rough weather. Bid them all fly, be gone. Sometimes it seems that more has been lost than ever remains, that we live in a slow passing among indecipherable signs, strangest and charm, the numbered particles of weight and light spin out the patterns matter takes. All that we know is consequence, hand, hair, moist skin, leaf curl, the day. As indistinct as water is in water, places dissolve into places, words among words. What is carried along, names whose sense shapes our memory, all that is said of what might be said, palatine or plat, a leaf, a stem, a proper noun, a spit curl of scum that draws along a moving stream, the probable line of what is seen.
And the audience was so responsive. I could read every day to Peter O'Leary, who was just, jumping out of his chair with pleasure over what I was doing. And it was an astonishing audience. So I've known Peter since he was in graduate school. I've known Alan Golding since he was in graduate school, and it goes on like that. So it was kind of amazing. And so I was choosing poems that I thought would be interesting to the audience, and then at the end I read some new poems because I never like to do a reading without doing something that hasn't already been collected.
Mm-hmm. When you went into the first three poems that are in the Night Songs and Clamors, did you have the urge to read the entire sequence, or?
Well, I did, but I wanted to move on, and the first three poems seemed to me to suit the occasion, particularly the second one, which is dedicated to my old friend Maureen Hunter, and it has a musical base to it. There's a lot of music in the rest of that poem, but that particular section is about a place in Omaha, Nebraska that really no longer exists as a museum there. But that space, that particular street where the streetcar came around, and the streetcar and the trolley, the electrical connection on the top of the streetcar would change wires, and it would always spark, particularly at night. It looked like a sparkler that you had on the 4th of July coming down, and so that seemed to me to be a way of knitting up some different things in the reading. That is, place in Omaha, Nebraska, time that was in the 1950s, and the music that I was going to do more of in the reading.
Today, I didn't know what to read, but I noticed that there is a building on the Louisville campus called Gottschalk, and that named for the great American composer Louis Maura Gottschalk. So I'm going to read Tin Deo, in which Gottschalk appears. Tin Deo was a piece done in 1947 by Dizzy Gillespie and Shadow Paso, the great timidist from Cuba. And the poem has to do with how Afro-Cuban music came into America over time. So it's called Tin Deo. Oh, Ache is a word from the Santeria, which means the human spirit. It's the central energy of the world. Ache, not so much in the beat as in the space, the silence, not quite silence, memory and anticipation between one beat and the next, the air above the drum skin, dizzy in tropic light. Move this way, it says, hips and arms in flight, heel and toe earthbound. What sunlight teaches is darkness, darkness light, sepal and whispering, Tin Deo, tumbadoras, there in syllable and song, habanero estrella turning. Gottschalk in Havana in 1854 heard it, spent months carefully noting the rests in the score for A Night in the Tropics. Nearly 600 instruments sound like dense foliage, banana tree and plumeria, and silences etched into the music, beat, moist skin and leaf's edge, light and shadow, the way hips move beneath the bundle balanced on her head, the dirt track, uneven grace and purpose, swing implies dance, estrellita, the little turn pauses and turns again. Stars above the sea's tumult turn in the night sky, slow dancing palm fronds thrash and thrash at the salt wind, swing over the waves, steady lift and fall. Kelp lines in the sand and brief phosphorus, tropic air tinged as always with decay. Kiss, did you say? The word merely or the act, breath's other beat and rest, the tongue sway, samba, double and triple, the horn behind the brush of finger and palm, the drumhead pulled taut, her abdomen tight as a melon, she says. Try it.
When you're working on a sequence like that one, it seemed to me to be a poetics that embraces that kind of appropriate for a nostalgic topic, as we're talking about the 50s and streetcars and seeing the sparks. And it reminded me a lot of the sort of the early work of Eliot, for example, that it's really invested in a certain kind of poetics that seeks to evoke a mood. Is that a fair assessment of what you were trying to do?
About that, the thing about that, Matthew, is that Eliot's early poems, particularly preludes, were among the group of poems that were enormously important to me, say, in the late 50s when I was starting out. And in fact, and then one of the fun things that happened as a result of that is that you're always knocked out by critics who see exactly through the haze created by a poem or a book of poems. And one of the fine reviews of that first book compared my versification to Eliot and to preludes particularly. But I don't think you're wrong about that. What I was trying to do in that poem is to merge those nostalgic items, the episode in the steel mill, and the streetcars and the two girls standing on the street looking across into that night that was too dangerous for them to enter, the place where sin exists. And I got things into that poem. I've been looking to get into poems, but then the next stage is Rameau, and that's Baroque music, and the Castor and Pollux, and it goes on, and then it has that episode from Lucretius in there. It goes on to other things. So I was trying to bring present speculation into the environment of the past. That's one of the things I try to do in poems, and that book particularly is about the solitude that I first experienced since I was 21, because it was after my wife passed away. And the whole book isn't elegiac in that sense. It does, some of it's there, and it does try to cope with that distance between memory and present experience.
Going down this road of thinking about your poetics and its relation to music is not a new question for you to have to field. It's an observation. It's an obvious observation. And one of the poems that you read, you talked about Tin Deo, a important watershed jazz standard now, I guess you might call it.
1947. That's amazing when you think about it.
And I was wondering if I could get you to talk a little bit about your feelings about the future of your kind of poetry that seems to be in such a symbiotic relation with American jazz music. Is this something that you see in danger, or what is the future for that style?
Well, I mean, jazz has become, it's strangely an academic exercise. I mean, most places where jazz is fervently played are colleges. I mean, this is near where I live. Well, near in Texas is a relative to the term, but at Denton, Texas, at Texas State, they produce this extraordinary range of instrumentalists out of a jazz program. In Illinois, Northern Illinois University had a great jazz program, but jazz has now, it's like an ironic turn on Brubeck's title, Jazz Goes to College. And the answer maybe is it went there and stayed there. There's still jazz being played, but in Austin, where I live, there have been several jazz things. And the joke among some of the musicians is that when they see me come in, they say, we're about to be finished, because I've been the last person in the audience for a number of these residencies. But, there is a new club that's open. I haven't been there yet because of the pandemic, but we'll see. The thing about jazz for me is that it represents what I'd like to do in poems. That is, I like to have the poem feel as though it's being invented in the moment, but is absolutely secure in its understanding of its own medium. So that I like the poem to feel certain at the same time that it feels as though it's coming into the present as a sort of invention. And that and that's, I don't know how to talk about that in terms of poetry and my anxiety for the future. One of my anxieties is that there's a lot of interesting writing going on now in the guise of poetry, but it's mostly just cut up prose because it's not interested very much in its own music. So you get these wonderful, basically experiential essays about one thing and another, and they seem not to be devoted to any kind of music or musical invention.
I share that anxiety, and it leads me to wonder if you feel that poets the new generation of poets coming up would do well to heed advice that I heard you give, repeating this advice on an earlier YouTube podcast, that it would do well for a poet to learn how to do something else other than poetry well, so that they can write about that. And one of the things that they might benefit from learning well is an appreciation of music.
Yeah, well, I'm a frustrated musician. I played the trombone when I was in school. I was never very good at it. I wanted to play jazz. I joined the combo, and I couldn't. If you're going to play jazz, you have to think in music. You can't think about music. You have to think in music. It's a different way of approaching an art form. But I do think it's important that poets engage themselves in other forms of study. I always recommended languages, and in one way or another, like foreign, to pick up a second or third language is a great thing. To do translation probably teaches you more about poetry than almost any other exercise. But also thinking about music and how music moves, and both classical and jazz, but also rock and roll. I don't write that much. I've written a couple of things involved with the rock, but I don't write that much about it. And it's odd because it was the music of my teenage years. It was being invented while I was in high school, but I never felt the same aesthetic attachment to rock that I feel to. I mean, I listened to it. Before the pandemic in Austin, I went out and listened to music maybe 2-3 nights a week, and a lot of that was blues or blues rock or Texas blues, and I like it, appreciate it. But in terms of informing what I do as a poet and thinking aesthetically, that doesn't play such a great part as jazz does. But that's, again, it's jazz is one of the great musical inventions of all of human history, and you could see that when jazz began to move into the Middle East. I mean, you get Brubeck and Louis Armstrong moving through Turkey and Greece. You get people moving in Paris. you suddenly have an entire world drawn to jazz because it proposed a different way of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the form, and that's hugely interesting. And I don't worry too much about poetry. Sometimes I bemoan certain kinds of things going on, but in fact, it keeps reinventing itself, and those inventions are almost always interesting. Also, you can't tell in the moment one invention in poetry is going to be the enduring one, right? In the 1950s, when I first started writing and publishing in the early 60s, if you look at American poetry, you would think that, the confessional mode and then a certain kind of ironic formalism, Anthony Hecht and, Howard Nemeroff and my colleague John Nims, who were all great sort of formal virtuoso poets, but writing basically ironic, distanced poems from their own experience. My friend and sometime teacher Carl Shapiro's poems, which are brilliant, but they're always at some distance, some removed from what they're writing about. Oh, wonderful nonsense lotions of Lucky Tiger. That's the start of his barbershop poem. But it's the and nonsense that govern that poem, the sense that the poet is at some distance from those materials. And then you mentioned Frank O'Hara in our correspondence, and you get to somebody like O'Hara, who simply steps into that world and, like Alice, steps through the looking glass and sees an entirely different world. So I like that, actually, because O'Hara's writing about self is entirely different than Lowell or Sexton's or anybody else writing about self. He simply steps into the self and then turns around and looks with, profound delight about what surrounds him.
I was wondering if I could get you to talk a little bit more about your connection to O'Hara and what you think your publishing efforts were able to do for him.
Well, I had been the poetry editor of a magazine called Audit and when I was in a graduate school in Buffalo, maybe starting in '62. And that was a magazine that had been founded by Ralph Maud as Audit, a magazine of poetry and opinion. That sort of waned after a while, and a guy named David Galloway took it up and turned it into a quarterly. And he asked me to be the poetry editor. And then David finished his PhD and went to Europe to teach and left the magazine to me. And I didn't have any money particularly, but I was able to talk Al Cook, the new head of the English department at Buffalo, into giving me some support. So he gave me an office. I took on Charles Doria as associate editor, and we sat down and had one of those profound conversations you have when you have the world ahead of you as all potential and no authority at all. We decided, in a way you do when you're, in your early 20s, what was the most important thing to do in American poetry. And we decided that long poems and single author issues would be the way to go. So then the question is, what single author will we do? Well, we had both read O'Hara, Back to Meditations in an Emergency. Second Avenue, you could only read really in Rare Book Room. And so we decided we'd do a whole issue devoted to Frank O'Hara. I called him on the phone at the Museum of Modern Art. I told him who I was. I said what we wanted to do. He said, that sounds great. And yes, we'll do it. And then there was some delay in getting this stuff. And my wife and I were in New York that winter. And so we agreed to go down to Frank's loft. And it was on Lower Broadway. And we went. And he took me to it was an old industrial loft, and what had probably been the coat hall at the front, at the top of the stairs, was the room where he had kept his files. And there was a stack of poetry manuscripts, maybe a better part of 4 feet tall. And he grabbed a big chunk of that, and we sat on the floor and looked at poems. And so I took more than we could ever publish. And I put them in a suitcase, and took them back to Buffalo and began to work on these things. And then he got in touch with me and said, I'm about to finish a new poem. It's quite long. Would you want to see it? And I said, yes. And that was Biotherm. So the issue, begins with some fairly recent O'Hara poems, a couple of older ones, like the little elegies, the James Dean poems, and then ends with that very long, incredibly complicated poem, Biotherm. But my role, that's what I did with O'Hara. That was one issue. We stayed friends, although he didn't last that long after that, but before the accident. But I saw him whenever I go to New York, and we'd have lunch. And so we, in that sense, became friends. And what I did, I think, of consequence is that issue. There was a kind of need for O'Hara in the world. We published 1,500 copies, which is unimaginable in an upstart magazine these days, and they all sold out. The whole issue sold out. At one point, we had a managing editor named Betty Cohen. She kept a few in her house. I don't think intentionally. She just, they just happened to be there. The book that came from City Lights, called Lunch Poems, had been accepted years before, but by Ferlinghetti, and then it was delayed for some reason. And I think maybe Ferlinghetti had heard O'Hara read. His enthusiasm may have begun to wane. It's hard to know, but the audit thing came out in '64, and that jogged. It's always been my view, the Lunch Poems, which came out the same year, and then of course, Frank was dead within a few years of that, and right. It was. So I don't know what positive role I have, except that I did find myself drawn to some pretty intricately designed O'Hara poems that were contemporary. They were new poems. There were new poems at the time, and most of the lunch poems were earlier from the 50s.
Mm-hmm. In talking about O'Hara, it seems that he's now positioned sort of ideally, really, as the crossroads, or a figure in the crossroads of the sort of multiple poetry camps that we were beginning to sketch out, as you were talking about Carl Shapiro, for example, and Anthony Hecht, and sort of that modernist strand that's very formal and distanced, and then that sort of beat strand that is, as you were talking about it, confessional and improvisational, and then the emerging language poetry sort of stuff, let's call it. And O'Hara seems, do you agree with that assessment as to why he might be such a significant figure?
Well, I think first of all, any poet is, raised in a sort of significance, that is cultural awareness, by the poets that follow after. And O'Hara was surrounded by an incredibly talented group of people, including Kenneth Koch, who was an absolute master and an incredibly capable poet, and John Ashbery, who at that time was living in Paris. But, O'Hara never gave a reading while John was out of the country without including one Ashbery poem. So that group, which was, very closely allied with each other, and then the other sort of stuff that happened in New York surrounding their activity, gave people greater sort of presence. The interesting thing about O'Hara is, until after he died, he never had a major publisher. I mean, if you figure that Grove was basically a renegade small press operation, particularly in the 50s, when they published, when Sorrentino was just there as editor, and they published Koch, Olson, Duncan, O'Hara, but eventually Koch had a major, uptown publishers, and Ashbery sort of started with a Yale book. So O'Hara was, it's interesting that after all of that, O'Hara is the one whose name comes to mind so quickly. There are a handful of poems that people also, that in the fate of a poem, there are poet, there are a handful of poems that people remember extremely well. The Lana Turner poem, for example, which for years when I would hand out a sampler, a mimeograph sampler to my classes if I did an introduction to poetry class or a beginning creative writing class, and the sampler always had the Lana Turner poem in it, sometimes A Step Away From You, and Creeley's I Know a Man, and Gwendolyn Brooks, We Real Cool. I wanted to show the students how quickly, almost suddenly, voicing could locate the poet in the poem. And so that, but O'Hara gives us a place there that you wouldn't see occupied otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Taking the conversation back to your visit to Louisville and the Brown reading and your approach to live readings, you commented that about your preference to not memorize a poem, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that you improvise off of the poem, but that it's important to you to read the poem live, and I believe you commented as if it was a score. And yeah. I was interested if I could get you to talk more about your philosophy about how you read your poems live.
Yeah, well, I have as almost famous memory, and I have a lot of poems in my head, including my own. Although I have discovered recently that in the last, since my selected poem was published, I think I've published 400 pages of poems, so I don't have them all in my head the way I have the early ones. But I like Alwick, and we knew each other for a long time. But he would do this thing in which he would, say which poem he's going to read, and then he'd put the book down and walk away from it and recite the poem. Well, that's one way of doing it. I never liked that idea for myself. I wanted to make the reading a relationship between my voice, the poem on the page, and the audience. And I did not want to do it as a recitative of some sort, or a theatrical situation where I memorized the lines. I wanted to make the book or the piece of paper a part of the reading, but I also found it a discipline for myself in the same way that you see a pianist, classical pianist who's has done the same sonata over and over again, and will have a page turner there. Not that he's going to look at the score, but that having the score there represents an interesting, evolving relationship to that kind of text. And that's the way I thought about it.
When I interviewed Tom Slay earlier, he had a similar investment in reading and in the idea that the printed poem was a kind of incantation in a way that between the audience and the poet brings something sort of viscerally to life in the room in the moment of reading, that maybe stretches to the idea you cracked it as a joke in the reading about the new Gnosticism, that there is something perhaps ineffable but valuable in the poetry performance. And I was wondering if that's putting it too strongly for you, or if you agree.
Look, we belong to what's now sort of in strange ways called the culture of the book. If you were raised as I was, as a Christian, there's a thing in the front of the church called the lectern. And in the process of the service, there is a reading from the text, and the book is there. And if you're raised in a Jewish tradition, the Torah is there, and it's so sacred you can't touch it. So you have a long silver rod with a sculpted hand and an index finger on it, and you can move that. You can move that. Well, actually, the other I made the wrong gesture. You can move that from right to left across the page. So that it is not new to us that the relationship of speaker to text to, in that case, congregation, is a unique one, and I think that has resonances for all of us. That and the other thing, which is a part of my life that I love, which is my mother was a wonderful reader, and my brother and sister and I would sit on the floor, and she would read to us. And the part that I remember best is one more chapter, please, 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 one more chapter, And after a time, we sort of knew all these stories by heart, and could mutter along with them. But it was the act of reading that weird sharing between the child, the book, and the parent. My wife, as you may know, was a specialist in reading and a professor of education. And she would always remind everybody that the single thing that predicts statistically whether or not a child will be an adult reader is whether or not he or she was read to as a child by their parents. And so I think between the sacramental reading and the familiar, you think back on it, the sacred was always had to do with the hearth. Its remnant is the candle in the church, but it always had to do with the hearth and what you did around the hearth, in speaking, storytelling, and reading. So yeah, I agree with Tom. My joke about the new Gnosticism was aimed at O'Leary, I think, and Norman Finkelstein, who are both new Gnostics. I'm troubled by that, but not for poetic reasons. It's poetically useful. I think politically it's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, we live, I have described myself as an unreconstructed abstract expressionist, an art form that came out of an anxiety about reverent iconographies, and following the fascist period in the from the 20s through the 40s, and that kind of sense of the fully received image or figure, I find troubling. So what I've done, following on the modernists who still speak to me, is to try to engage those myths as ordinary occasions rather than as sacred objects. But politically it worries me. But poetically, let them eat cake. I really love Peter's poems, and I admire Norman for what he does. Different kind of poetry, much more discursive than mine.
I was wondering if you thought that the dominance of, or at least limited dominance of, the new formalism was in some part due to the rise of the creative writing programs, as you've suggested, but specifically the ability, I guess, to manipulate and create influence through that structure of Yvor Winters in his position out at Stanford, and then the people that were trained under him. I know you had the opportunity. Did you have the opportunity to cross paths with Winters?
Well, we talked on the phone. I was his editor in only a titular fashion. That is, the last two books of his that were published at Swallow were published while I was editor, and I did edit a Janet Lewis book. The later books of the actual hand editing was done by a remarkably good guy named Ken Fields at Stanford. But I did know Winters, and of course one of the things that Alan Swallow did was to publish a lot of that Winters circle. But the interesting thing about Winters, and Archambault wrote a book about this, is that the group of poets in my generation who came out of Stanford And none of them are like Winters. That's John Mathias, Robert Haas, Robert Peck, James McMichael, Robert Pinsky. They were all at Stanford and Winters students at the same time.
Yeah.
And none of them writes like I suppose Pinsky's the one whose diction would be closest to Winters, but McMichael is an incredible lyric poet. Mathias is, of course, this extraordinary major poet in his own way, who takes up almost any subject with equal agility. And we all know Haas, who's the but you get two poets laureate out of that one class.
Right. And Tom Gunn earlier has I believe it was called On a Drying Hill, has written about his experiences with Winters. Right, that it is almost
the experience with Winters, particularly in terms of transgressive sexuality, shall we say, is a complicated one. Gunn goes out there, and Gunn had all the equipment that we think of that goes with formal poetry, and was able to do wonderfully interesting things. But also Hart Crane's engagement with Winters. Some people claim that Winters is responsible for his death in some bizarre way. But Winters, Winters saw himself when he moved into his odd form of formalism as leaving behind. He thought that if he had kept doing what he did as an early poet, he would have been known as a minor disciple of William Carlos Williams. And he wrote about Williams, early on in a book that I actually did edit that book with a guy named Frank Smith called The Uncollected Essays. And so there are some of those essays that he wrote when he's still at Chicago in the 20s. They're remarkable, and primitivism and decadence is remarkable for that reason. But he occupied a station out there, which was on the corner of America, and he championed all these poets who were sort of poetasters. He was remarkable in a number of ways, but anyway, that was one strain, kind of neo-Augustan thing. That's different from what came along as the new formalism a few decades ago, which I mostly thought of. I described it once, not very flatteringly, as one of those small cars that comes to the middle of the ring in the circus, and then more clowns get out of it than you could imagine could ever fit in. But
there is a way in which it's sort of the clown car that followed the sort of significant formal project with all of its moral investments that Winters championed, whether one agreed or disagreed with it, it meant something significant, whereas the new formalism seemed to be this kind of, mindless.
Well,
why were you doing it?
Yeah, the other problem is, just in terms of the question of reputation in poetry, is that there's an audience out there that doesn't particularly like poetry, but absolutely insists that it be the poetry they didn't like in the first place. So there is there's particularly an academic audience for that, but the Academy's engagement in terms of the flurries of attention getting it going in poetry really have to do not with what was done among the poets, but how it was received. So on opposite ends of the cultural spectrum, you have new formalism, which gets attention in the academic setting because it's the poetry they didn't like in the first place. It's what they want poetry to stay, and they don't want to be offended or challenged by poetry. The other is the language poetry, which had its own, philosophical groundings in linguistics and phenomenology, the phenomenology of language, but was incredibly companionable to that era of that. I think you just came out after it, of theory in the Academy,
right.
And so there was a companionability there that may not have been taken up by the primary. I don't think Searle was reading, Linagenian, but that the graduate students of that era had been particularly attuned to theoretical notions in having to do with language and impenetrability or the materiality of language, to use a phenomenological term, that they found a ready home in that circumstance.
Right.
So
Yeah.
and I don't think that's what Bernstein and company set out to do as a marketing tool, but it did have a marketing effect in the same way that the formalists did.
Right.
And to some extent, Black Mountain, because Olson, like Pound or Joyce, is an industry.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It does bring me back, as you were just mentioning, and I guess it'll be my final question for you as we wrap up. That I ended up, much to my surprise, as a graduate student at Duke University at its queer theory moment, but also at its moment where it was sort of the pinnacle and poster child for theory über alles. And and I was working with, among others, Eve Sedgwick there, and I kind of realized that I had gotten in through a kind of a fruitful misunderstanding of what my writing sample was, which
that's a great one.
I wrote about Frank O'Hara, and my argument was that O'Hara was heavily indebted not to the high canonical work of Hart Crane, but to the late Hart Crane, the sort of loose discursive Key West poems that were routinely discredited at the time as a fall off in power, as they wanted to read this sort of suicidal loss of power arc into Crane. And that in reality, the late work is really the most vital. If you look at what lives on in Crane's work, nobody writes like high modernist Crane, or at least I said anyway, but lots of people write like late style Crane. Let's look at Frank O'Hara. And Eve Sedgwick sort of assumed that I was into homopoetics and even understood what the term meant, which I had no idea at all at the time. I just was a poetry lover. So I was curious to know your own thoughts about the vitality of Hart Crane, and of that sort of high modernist style today.
Well, I was very taken with Crane, particularly when I was an undergraduate, and then read the letters and at least one of the big biographies, maybe more than one. I'm looking at my shelf here, but my fascination with Crane, first of all, was with the bridge because of its ambition. It is an ambition, unlike Leaves of Grass, which never finally got its full evolution. But there are things that happen there, like what it is to be moving along in speed and catch things only partially as you go by them. But the late Crane, which I've been reading lately, is especially interesting for two kinds of things. The rhetoric of early Crane is gone. And it was that rhetoric that held the materials together. So what happens, I think, in the later Crane that's interesting is a kind of faceting of intensities. So you get an intense observation followed by a break and another. So it's in many ways more cubist than the interesting stuff. But what I liked about that in Crane was that it escapes the governing rhetoric of the poem. And that's the feature most strongly carried on by the poets who are talking about of the 40s and 50s. That is, they had a kind of rhetoric and diction that held the materials of the poem together, and they were guided into, to some extent, by the new critics who wanted to see the poem as a kind of whole in which, a well-wrought urn, as the saying goes. But yeah, no, I think Crane is very interesting. I don't know the extent to which he influenced me. He certainly influenced O'Hara. O'Hara said once that in America only Whitman Crane, and Williams were more interesting than the movies.
I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with the poet Michael Anania. If you did, please consider hitting like and subscribe. And as always, please consider joining us for an upcoming conference presenting either live or virtually. Consult the LouisvilleConference.com for more details or reach out to me, Matthew Biberman, Conference Director. Thank you for listening.